Hello and welcome to the Life After Diets podcast. I'm Sarah Dosanjh, psychotherapist and author of the book I Can't Stop Eating.
And I'm Stefanie Michele, binge recovery health coach. If you feel out of control around food, we get it because we've been there.
Thank you for joining our conversations about how to make peace with food and feel more comfortable in our bodies.
Now on to this week's episode. Folks, you'd think by almost our 100th episode, we would have gotten this down, but I'm still namby-pamby about it.
About starting the episodes, you mean?
Yes.
Yes, I know.
Difficult. I can't get into I can't feel natural yet.
Yeah. We both kind of look at, for those of you who haven't seen us on YouTube, we both kind of look at each other awkwardly, sort of communicating non-verbally about who's going to start.
Yes. It's a little bit of a standoff.
We'll get there one day. Well, Steph originally couldn't figure out why her microphone wasn't working, then realized she hadn't plugged it in. So
yeah, that'll do it.
But yes, grazing. I guess first of all, what do we mean by grazing? Let's get that out there so we're all on the same page.
Okay, I was expecting you to Google it, as you're wont to do.
Oh, okay. I can. Yeah, let's Google it.
I mean, I think most people would implicitly understand what we say by grazing, but maybe we do have different definitions of it.
Do you know what though? I just put it in, and as I'm typing it in, I've only just realized where the word comes from.
Where?
Well, the idea that cows just all day are eating grass.
Oh, yes.
And that's the grazing, and we talk. I have never put that together. Yeah, I guess. I mean, if someone had asked me, I would have done.
So, like, we graze through our kitchens and we. It's like lack of meals to me. It's this. It's like this unpredictable here and there. Grab a little of this, grab a little of that. No boundaries to it. And by boundaries, I don't mean like amounts. I mean more like there's no beginning and end. It's not like a meal that has this beginning and end, and then there's this gap of time between the next eating period. That's just a sort of open-ended eating process that I associate a lot with weekends.
Well, do you want to hear what it says on the Wikipedia page? Oh, I'm going to tell you anyway. But it says it's a human eating pattern characterized as the repetitive eating of small or modest amounts of food in an unplanned manner throughout a period of time and not in response to hunger or satiety cues. Two subtypes of grazing have been suggested, compulsive and non-compulsive.
I like that.
Yeah.
I don't know that I like the not in response to hunger, because I think that it can be.
I thought I didn't like the unplanned bit because I think it can be.
Yeah, see? But I do like, I think it's more productive to think about it in terms of the compulsive and non-compulsive. Like as far as, because sometimes I think grazing can be perfectly fine. I just feel like it's not bad necessarily, but it can be problematic.
Well, I know the majority of times when I have a grazing day, I don't really feel good. I never really feel like I was properly satisfied at any point. And I can find the whole experience a bit dissatisfying, but it's not really until after the event that I realize I'm dissatisfied, because during it, the grazing or the back and forth is sort of a seeking of something that doesn't quite arrive.
Yes.
That for me is when grazing just feels a little bit, just a little bit uncomfortable, not quite what I want to be doing. And then I compare that to a hungry day, which could be a PMS day or something like, or a day where I'm very aware that I feel hungrier and I'm going back and forth, and perhaps my meals aren't really in place in the way that would feel best for me. That's different as well. And that one, I used to fight against that. I used to hate those days because they used to be really derailing. But now I kind of just accept them for what they are.
So I was thinking, I was showering this morning and I was thinking about this episode. I don't always do that, but I did today. And I was thinking about, like, I think my approach to grazing used to be, or feel like, the point was to learn how to stop, or the point was to learn how to change it. But now I think much more realistically, because I feel like I've been doing this for a long enough period of time that if stopping was the goal, or if that was going to happen, it would have by now, and it doesn't. And to your point, there are days where you said you feel like I don't really want to be doing this, and that still happens, where I find myself grazing and I know that I don't really want to be doing this, and yet I'm doing it. And so I modify this to grazing happens. We should make a t-shirt. Like grazing will happen. And it's more about like working with that. And to me, actually, a bulk of it is just not making something of it. Like just kind of accepting it, to your point. It's like, okay, this is that kind of day today. What else might I need even as I graze? What else, what might be going on for me? How might this feel better for me? Or maybe it's just not going to feel better for me. And I think too, I actually think this topic is harder for me anyway to think about or talk about as opposed to binge restrict. It's because the black and white in me, it finds it much easier to talk about the bigger things, the more extreme things, whereas grazing is very subtle sometimes, and it's not quite distressing enough to warrant some kind of intervention that feels like, okay, I really need to do. It's just kind of this like quieter, annoying pattern that I think it's sometimes harder to address that stuff. You know what I mean? Because it's just not big enough.
Yeah. How would you distinguish between grazing and a slow binge? I've had days where it feels like one long binge. It's not been any massive amounts in a short period of time, but it's felt like that.
Yeah.
Go on.
To me, the energy is the difference, right? So when I think of a long binge, there's almost like a voice in the back of my head telling me like, okay, after this, we're done. After this, we're done. And it feels like, okay, I'm just going to have it. And there's this, that voice that I put on to represent my anxiety. Like that's going on a lot in the back, and it's compulsive. Whereas a grazing kind of day is a bit more like, I almost, if there were words to it or thoughts attached to it, would be like, I don't know. Just sort of like a little bit more, I can't put my finger on something. It's not stressed per se, maybe a little bit of stress, but it's more like, it's a little bit more laid back than a slow binge, which is just a lot more of like almost like a tunnel that just it's just getting narrower and narrower and darker, and you don't know where the end is.
But would you say it's a bit more laid back, or just that you are? So that's how it feels now.
Both.
Okay.
What is your brain?
Well, because you were saying like the graze is this and the binge is this, and the graze, it's more laid back, as if the grazing itself was more laid back. And I wondered, for me, by not fighting and not being in as much conflict around food as I have been, I can be more laid back.
Yes.
So therefore it takes on a different energy, because I've taken on a different energy, as opposed to it's this that has the different energy. Does that make sense? Like it's coming from me, as opposed to the behavior the other way coming back.
Well, that's like a chicken or egg question.
That's my favorite type of question.
Oh, really?
No.
Yeah, no, I think it's perhaps it's my energy that has changed it, but not quite. I don't think 100%, because I think that a long binge is a bit different. I think that there's something about the way that looks and the amounts we're having and the urgency with which we're having it. Well, maybe that still is related to energy, but the impact of a graze is, if it's not physiologically different, it's psychologically different, and it doesn't feel like I've eaten a proper meal. There really is a difference in satisfaction levels and feeling finished when you're talking about grazing versus meals on a plate. Like the visual of that, the ritual of that, and maybe even the way that food sits in your stomach at one time as opposed to spread out in different ways. I know that my hunger responds differently to a meal that has a hit. Like when I eat something all at once and it's got density and like, boom, it lands in my stomach, and it gives my stomach that cue of, thank you, that receptor has received input. There's enough pressure there. I feel done. Versus a slower, steady, like it might be even more calorically to graze throughout the day, but it's not. It's almost like there's a pressure valve in the stomach that's not getting hit. It's just slowly being dripped on, and it's never reaching a certain threshold that needs to communicate back to the brain, I have received food. I don't know if that's true for everybody, but it's certainly something that I notice. So I do better with meals because I need that sort of pressure in the stomach. And it doesn't matter what the calories are. It doesn't matter how much I've actually eaten. It's something about the way it's spread out or not spread out that matters to my brain somehow.
Yeah, I think I totally relate to that as well. I think there's something as well for me about when I've when I again, I want to be careful how I say this. There's just something I've really noticed that for me, and this is very personal to my body, having gaps between my eating increases my satisfaction. That's just
Mhm.
something I've noticed. A lot of treatment plans and a lot of the advice out there, which I think is a great place for people to start when they're trying to regulate their eating, is the whole 3 meals and a couple of snacks. And I would say that's probably the wisest thing for people to be trying to do. I did personally notice that I felt better having had those gaps, which is not to say if I fancy a snack, I won't have a snack, but I have to fancy it. And then when I fancy it, it's enjoyable and it's satisfying. But to just have a snack because it's time to have a snack, for me now, I think decreases my satisfaction. But I don't want to put that, I
Yeah.
don't want that to put anybody else off having snacks as like mechanical eating, because I think it's important for
Yeah.
just recovery and regulating appetite
I
cues.
can speak to that because I think that physiologically I'm like you, where I actually think I feel better when I just have breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I'm going to make a caveat on that where there might be an afternoon snack that's necessary just because there seems to be a much bigger gap between lunch and dinner. And that I will get hungry actually and need a snack in the mid afternoon, but I feel better otherwise having those gaps. However, I've got a psychological component that I can't ignore that still has a sensitivity to that, where there is some kind of scarcity trigger that will happen if in other words, I can't actually do that multiple days in a row, even though because I've tested this, but there's something that happens to me where if I'm edging just even on the cusp of getting too hungry, there's something that gets fearful in my body that's like, uh-oh. And then I'm finding myself being much more impulsive with food. So in order to keep that calm, I tend to need snacks sometimes, most days. Sometimes I cannot. And that's how I gauge it is I actually check in. I mean, I call it checking in. It sounds so fancy, but it's more just I can sense when there is this rising in me of like, I'm thinking a little bit more about food. I'm noticing a little bit more like when I open my fridge, for example, let's say I'm getting my kids something and I'm noticing that my instinct is almost to grab something and put it in my mouth before I've even thought about it. When that starts to happen, I'm like, okay, there's something in me that's getting a little nervous because it's been several hours since I've eaten. And so I just want to point out that there's two things that play potentially here. And if you've got a restrictive history, that psychological scarcity is going to be louder, most likely, even if your physiology prefers the other way. And that's something I'm always navigating. And I have an open mind about like how the rest of I mean, who knows? This could change. The psychological scarcity may abate over more time. I don't know. But right now, it feels like I need to have those snacks, even though I'd probably prefer to do it in a more just with meals.
Yeah, and I think it can be problematic as well to be deciding ahead of time, "Oh, I'm not gonna snack because that's the best way not to do it." You know, it's the psychology of almost going, "Okay, I've had breakfast," and now if your mind is gonna go, "Oh, now I should wait to lunch." Even if it's
Yeah.
just so I can feel satisfied, as soon as you turn that into a should,
Yes.
and now I just have enough flexibility that it's okay. If I fancy a snack, or quite often if I'm with someone and I'm offered a snack and it's a tasty snack, I'm gonna have it if I like it.
Yeah.
But that's taken a while, I think, to get to that point. If I started at the behavior level of going, this is what my behavior should look like around
Yeah.
food, I'd have tied myself up in knots. I would have rebelled,
Absolutely.
and there would have been like a compulsive pushback against that.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. The language matters, the expectation matters, and the energy that those things hold matter. But what about grazing in a different context? So, grazing as a way of avoidance or numbing, or a little bit more of that sort of pathological potentially grazing, where it's an effort to. It's not just from boredom, or it's not just from I don't know, from lack of structure, or just, it's got a little more charge to it. It's more like I need to keep something away, and this is how I'm doing that. I'm using food to avoid.
I was thinking about this in terms of emotional eating. I think the classic view of emotional eating is, oh, you feel an emotion or you notice an emotion coming, it feels uncomfortable, and so you turn to food to feel better. That's the very basic classical version of emotional eating. And I was thinking the other day, in my mind, it was kind of splitting it into two parts. There was that kind of version where a feeling comes or is trying to come, and food is a way to divert, numb, suppress, avoid, or even just feel better. And then there's another type of emotional eating, which is more about dealing with a chronic state. So a chronic state of emotion. It's not this fluctuating thing. It's almost this baseline level of not, to use really basic words, of not feeling good. So that could be a state of depression. It could be a state of anxiety, a state of stress, a state of shame. And that, I think, is what came to mind when you were talking about it like that, that grazing or sort of slow binging, kind of moving into that compulsive place where it feels like it's almost compounding the state, right? Because we know that binging and feeling out of control with food could compound all those things: depression, anxiety, stress, shame, all of it. And at the same time, it's trying to manage a state.
Yeah.
So then, like, there's something in there around the state that's the problem, because if you try and take the food away, the state's still going to be there. It hasn't fixed the problem. I thought if I took food away, I'd feel great. I took food away and I was like, oh, whoa, there's a whole load of crap under here that I wasn't expecting to see. I thought food was my only problem.
And yet, knowing that almost implies, oh, well, like food's not fixing it. Therefore, we shouldn't need the food. But there's an addictive quality about that kind of grazing to me. And I do not mean that the food is addictive. I mean that the behavior is. And I'm reading Dopamine Nation right now. Have you started it?
No, I didn't know when we were going to do it. I was going to read it at the same time as you.
Oh, I thought that's funny because it's been on my nightstand. I'm like, Sarah's probably like halfway through it by now. I need to start it. I read the beginning.
Okay, we'll talk about it afterwards. The time.
We'll talk about that.
Yeah.
But this idea of that you have actually spoken about this in a past episode. The like it's not necessarily even always about just the pleasure of the eating, but the pain of not. And so if you're dealing with this chronic state of something, and food is this, like it's a little bit of an escape from it, even just a little bit. That the idea of not doing that. So if the idea comes to your mind of like, oh, there's those chips in the pantry. Like, I could just go grab those, right? And if we become addicted to the patterns of thinking, that we're involved in. And then the idea of like, oh, well, I don't want to, I don't want to keep grazing, or, I've already had, I wait till lunch or whatever. Then you're dealing with like, that's a pain infliction. Like there's something of, well, then there's this out and I'm not taking it. And that's almost like that knowing is more painful. And so there's this addictive quality that develops around that behavior, especially when you're dealing with a state of emotion that's underneath and you don't necessarily have the energy to even want to be thinking this through. You know what I mean? You're just like, I don't care. I'm struggling a little bit. Like, I'm just going to do what's easy. And what's easy is continuing to go back and get the moment of feeling a little bit better, and then it goes away, and then you want to feel a little bit better, and then you feel it, and that's just such an easy way to do it that I think that it's to be dealing with that while you're in a state of stress of some kind it doesn't feel possible. I think it's easy to talk about outside of the state. Like right now, we might be able to see that clearly, but when you're in it, this knowledge feels moot. You know what I mean? It feels really like that's nice, but I don't care. Like I just need to do this. It's very present moment. It's very, I need to feel good right now. I need to feel good right now. And there's this thing that can help me do that. And I think it's just human nature to take those things. It's why we keep scrolling and can't put the phone down. It takes a lot of energy to shift gears like that. And when you're not feeling well mentally, you're not really in a place to be shifting gears.
But even that thought, I want to feel good right now, I think it's not even feeling good, right? It's relief. I need some relief from this. And I think that's where people feel confused, because they're like, I'm not even enjoying the food.
Right.
But I would imagine for the majority of people, there's still some relief in those moments when you're eating, even if it's not pleasure or enjoyment in the way we might imagine, savoring our food, tasting it and just feeling relaxed and enjoy it. It's not that, but it's relief. And you're right, it's this cycle. It's like, where can the cycle be interrupted? How do we do that, Steph?
Glad you asked, because I know.
I think that interrupts how we feel, right? So for me, if I've been in what I would call like a chronic state of something, where I've been, let's say, low, whatever that might be, I have found that even having these moments of proper connection with people has given me some relief from the whole cycle. It's been enough to interrupt how I was feeling, enough to kind of gain a bit of perspective and move out of that a bit. So I guess it's finding ways. I think it's support. I think social support is enormously helpful. I think even resources are helpful. The amount of times I have watched a video or listened to something, heard something when I was in that binge cycle, and it interrupted it for me. It didn't last forever because there was more work that needed to be done. But sometimes, like, first time I read the intuitive eating book, I'd been binging every day for I don't know how long, like months and months. And I read the intuitive eating book and I didn't binge for a couple of weeks. It came back and I got rid of intuitive eating for a few years after that. I was like, this doesn't work. But it did interrupt it.
Yeah. I don't know. Some people might find conflict with this statement, but there's times where I think for someone who's got a bit of an addictive personality, that the only thing that is able to interrupt that is something almost as addictive or equally addictive. So, for example, when I think about going for a walk as a way of interrupting that, not going to happen. I love walks, but I don't find them as like stimulating as maybe you do or someone else might. There's certain things though that will sort of like pique my curiosity a little bit. We're like, one of them is massage. And I've talked about like my husband I used to be like, can you give me a massage? Because it would be something that would actually, I was willing to come out of a food place for that. There's something of the relief in that felt like, and honestly, I don't ever get tired of a massage. I will sit there as long as you'll have me and never tire. It is something I could also binge on. Information as well. So when I would find, like, if I had found your YouTube videos at the time when I was needing them, I would have then, and I think people do this. I think people do this with the podcast, just consumed, binged on that. And that would distract me for a bit. And there's a couple of other things that I can think of, but it's almost like that addictiveness. It's like working with that. And I don't think anything else it has to be somewhat addictive. It's scrolling, like there has to be something else that pulls me enough and allows me to have that same type of relief as food might. I would just maybe hope that it would be like less of an issue. Like it wouldn't create more problems the way food ended up doing. But a massage, sure, there's no long-term ramifications of that. Or, scrolling there can be, but information for me is wonderful. I love collecting information and I can get lost in it, but it doesn't harm me to do so to the degree that binging did, or grazing chronically did, or long binges, I guess I would say there. So there's some kind of replacement addiction. In my opinion.
I've experienced that. I think a common way that can come up for people as well is sometimes in things you don't necessarily think of, like spending. I think is one that comes up. There's a little bit of research that shows a link between binge eating and overspending. I guess there were two ways then. So one could be almost like jumping tracks. It's like what I'm hearing when you're saying that. And it'd be something else that I might use for a bit. But other times it was like a genuine interruption of my thought pattern. I was going around in this cycle of thinking over and over again. And I would read something, I would hear something, and it would shift my thinking. But it never felt like quite enough to stick. There needed to be this emotional shift as well, which I guess came with some time and some repetition. And that's why I always talk about this constant resetting. I had to keep resetting and remembering, oh yes, when I focus on these things, when I hold on to these intentions, I can bring myself back into a sense of regulation, but I could easily forget that.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you saw, but there's someone in the Life After Diets community on Facebook this morning. I saw the post come in, and this person has been in the community for a long time and shows up every day. She's working at this over time, many months. And this morning she came and she posted, I just have to post this win. And it was like this shift had occurred in her behavior and in her thought process. And you could feel this like, almost like, yeah, like I know you've been saying these things for so long, but it's coming into fruition. And when I read it, I was like, that's that timepiece, like where these shifts it's not like, what do I do to get out of this binge? I need a mind shift. I need a change of perspective. And you go find it and there it is. It's much longer range. It's like these things that keep presenting themselves, and you keep plugging them in. And that might mean you're still binging, or you're still grazing, or the food stuff's still going on. But you're still taking something in and not giving up on that. And I think that's the hard part, because there's such a tendency to say like, screw it. Like it's not working, and then we sort of give up on it. But if we keep showing up for it and keep saying, I'm going to keep my mind open to that, keep my mind open to that, keep showing up for myself, keep doing this stuff, that's where I think there is that embodied shift that eventually does happen after all of those months or whatever of intellectual training.
So really you're saying if people want to shift this stuff, they need to come and join our community and be checking in and doing the work with us, yeah?
Kind of.
If you want connection and support around any of the topics we talk about on the podcast, we would love for you to join our membership community.
Members have access to monthly online support groups, a private Facebook group, live episode recordings, and member-only Q&As.
If you would like to join us, please head to lifeafterdietspodcast.com/community.
Now let's get back to the episode. Honestly, I don't mean, or I think it's just to find an avenue that provides that support or supports this whole endeavor consistently.
What about somebody who says, just going back to grazing, somebody who says, I think I graze and I keep going back to the food just because it's so delicious. Just because that particular food, it nudges me a lot. You were talking about nudge theory the other day. What would you say to that person?
I get it. I don't know. That just seems like a simplistic thing. Food is delicious, and I think some of us have more of a connection to it than others. And I consider myself to be one of those people. To be honest, I find food very delicious, and I enjoy it very much. Maybe there is some kind of that addictive behavior might be part of it, right? Where there's this sense of like, that's the place I go to find the relief and or the pleasure, whether it could be one or the other. And it becomes just something you do. And then the thought of not doing it is so hard. I think about that a lot because I think sometimes I'm like, I think a lot of these things are easy for me to say now because they've become habits too. Like I've gotten out of that habit of binging or out of the habit of grazing. I'm going to caveat that in a minute because I want to talk about that. Because I still graze, but I don't have a habit of doing it day in and day out anymore. But because it's not a habit, I don't feel like I'm missing something anymore. Whereas I think if you're inside of that cycle, then you're actually giving something up to not do it because your brain's just moving towards it. And it's like to stop that somewhere is to say no, like it's abrupt. It's like, what? That's what I do. Whereas I'm not feeling that missing component. You know what I mean? It's the same as if you've got a bowl of ice cream in front of you. I always thought that about working at an ice cream shop. If I worked at an ice cream shop, I would feel restricted all the time because I wouldn't want to be eating it all the time. Whereas if it's not in front of you, you don't feel that, you know what I mean? So I think there's something to be said of that cycle of habit. That's part of that because I believe that you can love food and find food very tasty and delicious and wonderful and not have disorder around it. And I'm assuming that you're speaking to a place in disorder because if you just love food and you like to eat it, then there can also be fine. You know, you can eat it. You know what I mean? I'm assuming you mean to somebody who's struggling with that.
Yeah, of course. And I guess for me, there's a tipping point where the food no longer feels good, and what's happening at that tipping point. So I don't know why it's popped in my head. For some reason, hot cross buns have popped in my head. I'm in New York. We had Easter and there was just no hot cross buns here. And I was sad about that. But they do, in Marks and Spencer's, they do like 9 mini ones. So they're little baby hot cross buns. And 9 in a pack.
Is that the one I had?
You had you had mini ones, didn't you? Yeah, you did. Yeah, exactly the ones. And you didn't like them. Steph doesn't like hot cross buns.
I didn't.
Believe it. I don't think you were allowed
they weren't
back
hot either. Maybe
but it wasn't. It was the mixed spice. It's hot. Mixed spice tastes like mixed spice, whether it's hot or cold. So, and I'm not taking the time to heat it up if you're not going to enjoy it, Steph. I'm just not in it. But so something like those for me, like I've had those in before and been like, oh, I'm going to go and have a mini hot cross bun, and it's a few bites. And I have that, and I'm like, oh, I think I want another one. And I'll go back, have another one. At some point now. Normally, I think around, I'm reluctant to put a number on it because it would depend on the day and if I was hungry. Anyway, but let's say like normally around 2 or 3, there's a sense of like, okay, that was really enjoyable. I can feel it in my body. So I think there's something around here as well, which is maybe another podcast about interoceptive awareness, right? I can feel it in my body. And I know when I go back again, it's not going to taste as good. I kind of like, I feel that now. It's a felt sense of like, oh, okay, like this is my line. And sometimes I'll have another one and I'll be like, oh, that felt like, oh, now, in hindsight, I would have liked to have stopped one earlier.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's a point coming. Stand by. There really was a point coming. The enjoyment of those had nothing to do with hunger, right? It was very much a taste thing. Just coming back to, I guess, the question that I posed around like, when things taste good, if we're not connected to our body or being able to just gently check in, like, how am I doing? It's really hard to say stop from an external place. If I got those 9 hot cross buns, put them on the side and said, right, I'm only allowed to eat them 2 at a time, I'm going
Mm-hmm.
to set myself up for something. So I don't know that there's something in that. But if I was getting stressed, if I was going, oh, I need to be losing weight, I'd be stressed that I even want hot cross buns.
Right. Right.
And that's going to cause the conflict. And it
Yes.
keeps coming back to me, like this word conflict just comes up again and again and again with this. How do we reduce conflict around food so that we can feel into it a bit more? And also, I know that if I have a couple and I feel like I've had enough, there's also plenty left. I'm gonna have more later as well.
Yes, but when you've got either the thought in the back of your mind of I'm doing something wrong, or I shouldn't be, or you've got guilt happening, or planning to not do this tomorrow, that is going to interrupt your interoceptive awareness. You're not going to have the presence of mind to tap into that knowing, which is part of what I wanted to talk about when I was mentioning that I still graze. I still have days like that, but they don't become chronic. And I think that was something that used to happen, is once that kind of day would happen, it would take a life of its own and I wouldn't know how to stop. So the next day would just begin the same thing. It was like I just couldn't stop the cycle. And I think that the difference, and why in the beginning of the episode I said I don't think it's about stopping grazing days, those days happen. But the difference for me is that I don't have a mentality, and this has taken a long time too. This wasn't something you just decide to do one day. Of shoot, oh, I'm doing something. Oh no, the fear around it, the alarmism around what's going on there on a day like that, or 2 days like that, or around my ovulation, 3 days like that, is not met with fear and panic. And that then leads to, all right, tomorrow, all right, today's like this, but tomorrow's going to be better. Tomorrow's going to be different, which is essentially the same idea of, even if you're not talking about restriction, it's still that diet mentality of, okay, tomorrow. It's like that clean slate syndrome, where there is pathologizing about a day like that or a couple days like that, there is going to be a setup for it rolling over on itself. And that creates a cycle. And I think I see that a lot, where there has been an outright, there's been a rejection of diet culture. There's been permission around foods. There's been an invitation to self-compassion and these things. And yet there is this pervasive sense of fear around behaviors that don't feel quote unquote intuitive, or they have some kind of semblance to old behaviors that meant something. And then that part of our brain lights up like, oh no, what are we doing wrong? Oh no, we're doing, oh no. And then that creates that sends it on a different track. Then all of a sudden it's got a different trajectory where it starts to feed on itself, versus this kind of, this doesn't feel great today. And okay, like that sort of compassion, of that simple compassion of just understanding and of being like, yeah, this doesn't feel great. It's not my favorite. Okay, I'm going to keep moving along, because at some point when you can stay in that present moment with yourself, it shifts, like eventually without much, I don't know. I can't speak for everybody, but for me, it ends up that after a few days of that, it naturally sort of, then there's not a fear around like, okay, I feel like getting back to meals. That feels welcome at this point now.
My mind's jumped to people working from home, right? And that whole, it's a weird environment, I think, this working from home thing, where we don't necessarily get out the house to travel to work, not necessarily being with people in person. You're at home. For a lot of people working from home, they're sitting in front of a screen as well. As I'm thinking about grazing, I'm thinking of that sort of wandering into the kitchen, like, sort of looking for something in that sort of vague, vague way. Yeah, that kind of thing. Or knowing that there's something there and trotting off, and where it doesn't feel, I'm not saying every decision has to be like super consciously thought through or anything like that. But a pattern that I still see myself doing at times is when I've been working at something and there's a completion. It's normally at completion. It's not normally even a break. It's normally when I've completed something that I've put a lot of effort into. There's this desire for something, and it's making me think about, we're going to do an episode on dopamine, so we'll go into this a bit more, but like the dopamine balance that Dopamine Nation talks about, I've paid this price, I've done the work, I could put the effort in, and now like I want the pleasure balance, and there's this sort of seeking of pleasure, but being able to do that in a way that feels okay. And that's the not catastrophizing part. But if I find myself doing that, I notice that I'm doing a lot more. So it's becoming more and more frequent just because of how I've been feeling that week or what work's been like that week. Those are the times when I'm like, oh man, I have to come back to myself. Like, I've got to check in with myself.
Yeah.
Because there's something that's going on. And those are the times. So I'm not journaling every day at the moment, just not feeling particularly inclined to. But those are the days where I need to sit down and I need to name what's going on. And we talk about this all the time. But the naming of something, that bringing like, okay, I'm feeling this, I'm desiring this. It helps to process, I think, what you're doing, because otherwise it feels like you're just living in this vague sense of always wanting food. And the problem is I just always want food.
Yeah. Do you think it always has to be about something going on, though?
No, well, that was, I guess, my question before about when something is just delicious.
No, I see. So as you were talking, I was thinking about how, and I think the reason I'm being devil's advocate on that is because I'm like, I don't want a journal. I don't want to pull out my journal, which I don't do. I don't do that. But sometimes I think that, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say that gets to the point where it's starting to feel a bit dysregulated. I'm not just talking about, that's happening once a day or something. I don't know. It's a feeling. It's like a niggle. I kind of know that there's something that's building up that's going on that I'm not recognizing. And I know that if I want to get back to a sense of feeling regulated and balanced, this is the path I know. Like this is the one. And often there's so much relief in it. It's only the initial getting myself to do it that's the hard part. And then there might be some emotions that come up and I feel those, but they tend to feel really good at that point, just getting it out. And just meeting myself with so much, I want to use the word compassion. I know it's such an overused word, but really meeting myself and going like, okay, Sarah, I'm here. We're here. Like, I don't even know who I'm here. It's like, I hate this kind of language. Sometimes it sounds so wanky, but returning to myself.
Yeah.
Sorry. I don't have better words for it.
We should come up with some terms that sound like chill.
Yeah.
Like cool.
Yeah. Not so flowery and esoteric.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But no, maybe there is something going on. Maybe I've just never done that enough, and I could stand to gain a lot from naming what might be going on that I'm not even aware of, maybe. But at this vantage point, I feel like sometimes that sort of pattern I would get into of that. I work from home too. And in those times where I'm like, let's go out there just for distractions purpose and, just like pull this out or pull that out. I think sometimes it can just be a habit cycle or I don't know, just a little bit mindless. You know what I mean? And I will call it, if that becomes a chronic thing where I'm like, this is beginning to, like, my balance on this feels thrown off. And there doesn't feel like there's something going on underneath that's causing that to happen. It just seems to, I just have gotten into the pattern of it. I might just have some kind of intentional, like, okay, I'm going to be a bit more mindful about that now. And that does not feel threatening to me now, but it would have at a different time. And I want to say that because if you don't feel like that's possible, there might be a reason for that. But at this point, I feel like, oh yeah, I'm getting into this habit of doing it like that. And it's not feeling great. It's more like, it's more satisfying something in the moment, but it's not serving me long term. And so I'd like to break that. And so I'm going to be more mindful about that now.
What does that mean when you say I'm going to be a bit more mindful about that? Because that can be interpreted in so many different ways. How are you using that for you?
Okay. So my pantry has so there's a few staple items in my home that I will go to in like working from. One is corn chips. I love them. They serve such a wonderful, fantastic purpose for me so many times when I want them. Nuts. I keep them in my freezer. I love some frozen nuts. They're a bit salty. And chocolate chips sometimes I'll throw in there. Those are the two that like I find that myself most often like that'll be the beginning of some kind of grazing cycle. So being mindful about it is like where there might be just this sense of, okay, I've finished this task. I'm going to walk in the kitchen, going to open the fridge, going to grab the nuts, where I'm like, do I want the nuts? It's kind of just slowing it down a little bit and being like, do I really want these? Like, is this something I'm hungry for? Or is this something my mind needs right now? Or am I doing this now because that's what I've been doing, or because it's there? And I will ask myself that question. And there are definitely times where it's like, yeah, I still want them. I need them right now. I don't feel comfortable not having them. But there's other times where I feel like, no, this is just, I'm doing it because that's what I did yesterday. That's what I did, that's what I did earlier this morning. And it's just sort of like, for lack of anything else to do, that's what I'm doing. And then I'll sort of be like, oh, okay, right. That's not actually what I need to do. What I need to do is I'll send that email I'm needing to send. Right. That's what I'm going to do. It's just having a little bit more consciousness about why I'm doing it. And I would say that if that answer was coming back to me of like, no, I need it, that might be a time where I'd be like, then there might be something else going on where this is happening time after time. And there seems to be this urgency in the absence of hunger. That would indicate to me that something more is happening. But if it's more of the mindless sort of grazing that doesn't feel like it has a lot of energy, that's where mindfulness will come in for me.
Gotcha.
I feel like we didn't hit on a whole bunch of parts of this, but maybe if listeners don't think we covered enough, if there's more questions or more scenarios that you'd like us to explore, please do let us know. And I would be happy to continue talking about this topic.
Yeah, it's a big subject. There's probably lots of different avenues we could have gone down. I said avenue because that's a transatlantic language. Not streets, not alleys. Avenue.
Street, we use street.
Oh, that's true. That's true.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Well, all right, folks. Have a good day. Have a great day.